"Mr. President, my daughter hasn't eaten in 2 days. Tell me how many people have to die before this country calls it an emergency." Ibrahim froze, not because of the words, but because of the eyes behind them. A gaze that held no anger, no hope, just emptiness. It was an unannounced morning. President Ibrahim had chosen to walk through the city square without guards, without cameras. He wanted to see the country with his own eyes, and he did. A crowd, worn, exhausted, silent. These weren't beggars by choice. They were former factory workers, people who had once built their lives around the Anatrans plant. But the factory was dead, and so was their future. A child sat next to her mother, thin, expressionless, holding a cracked plastic spoon. There were no statistics needed, no reports. The truth was laid bare. The air was thick with heat and silence. Ministers hadn't noticed. Advisors hadn't warned him. But the people had been living this crisis for months. President Brahim said nothing. But he didn't walk away. He stood. Long enough for silence to become a message. Long enough for his presence to trigger a chain reaction that would quietly but violently shake the entire political system. How many more children must sleep hungry before we call it an emergency? The voice was low, but every word struck like thunder. President Ibrahim leaned forward across the table. His eyes didn't blink. The early morning light cut through the windows of the presidential war room like a blade, as silence wrapped around the ministers like a noose. The Minister of Finance glanced nervously at the Minister of Industry. No one dared speak. A 3 a.m. emergency meeting, no press, no advisors, no pre-written speeches. Just the president and the handful of people who controlled the fate of the national economy, and they were facing a man furious beyond words. Anatrans used to be the beating heart of Bobo Dioulasso. Now that heart has stopped, and you sit here counting GDP points. He slammed the table. We don't need more indicators. We need to save our people. No one protested. How could they? Outside, hundreds of former workers, mothers, veterans, displaced families, were sleeping on the streets, begging for food. Within 72 hours, something unprecedented began to unfold. The National Fund for Economic Development was ordered to release emergency financing. Technical teams were deployed to the ruins of Anatrans, and the Minister of Industry was given an ultimatum. Want to keep your seat, bring that factory back to life in 90 days. When the team arrived at the plant, they were met with devastation. Rust covered every conveyor. Machines lay cold and dead. Shattered glass, sagging beams. But more haunting than the factory itself were the former workers standing outside the gates, staring in like mourners at a tomb. A woman approached. Her face was sunken, eyes hollow. You're here to inspect and leave again, right? We don't want sympathy. We want our dignity back. The lead engineer replied sharp and short. The president sent us. We're not here to leave. We're here to restart. Skepticism hung in the air until trucks rolled in. New equipment, new generators, and then the banner unfurled across the main gate. We want you back. We need every hand. We believe in every heart. In the days that followed, the factory came back to life like a phoenix. Young engineers, once interns at Anatrans, returned to rebuild the production systems. Women volunteered for 3-shift work schedules. Thousands of farmers previously cut off when contracts vanished were reconnected with renewed supply deals at better rates. Within 60 days, the first production line hummed again. By day 90, products began rolling out. By day 100, Anatrans had returned to Burkina Faso's industrial map. One local official muttered, watching the factory gates reopen. We didn't just revive a factory, we revived hope. But perhaps the most unexpected moment was President Brahim's choice to say nothing. No press conference, no grand ribbon cutting. Only a single internal letter sent to every Anatrans worker. I did not save you. You saved yourselves. I only did what a leader is supposed to do, stop when it mattered, and walk beside his people when it counted most. They had done the impossible. Anatrance was back, machines were running, workers were singing again during shift changes. Cafeterias that once served dust now served hot meals. And yet something even deeper had changed, something no machine could measure. The country had seen what it looked like when power paused, when a leader didn't rush past suffering, but stood still long enough for the people to catch up. In a letter written in red pen taped to the office wall by a newly hired janitor were 5 words, "You made us visible again." That note spread faster than any news article. Ministers started printing it. Factory workers pinned it to their shirts. Farmers wrote it on sacks of raw cashews being delivered to the plant. People didn't just get jobs back. They got something far rarer, they got seen. Inside high-rise offices in the capital, some whispered, "This isn't sustainable." Others muttered, "He's doing this for popularity." Some foreign consultants warned, a president should not interfere with market dynamics. But Ibrahim didn't answer them. He didn't need to. He had 300 workers who answered for him. He had 5,000 farmers who could now feed their families. He had children who no longer cried from hunger. He didn't just revive a factory. He rewrote what leadership looked like in a time of quiet despair. At the factory gate, a mural was painted by one of the young engineers. It showed workers with their hands raised not in protest, but in purpose. Underneath the words, "We are not the nation's burden, we are its spine." That message spread far beyond Anatrance. In the north, teachers returned to abandoned classrooms. In the east, local cooperatives reopened. In the west, young people once tempted to flee across the border began lining up at training centers. Something bigger than production was happening. People were remembering who they were. One morning without announcement, Ibrahim returned to Anatrance. He stood outside the same gate where the woman had once accused him of pity. This time she wasn't crying. "I've made my daughter proud," she said, wiping her hands on her factory apron. "That's more than any program or aid ever gave me." Brahim nodded. He didn't speak. Just like that first day silence said more. In the months that followed, the Anatrance principle became something of a legend in national governance. 3 rules emerged. Look people in the eye before writing their fate on paper. Stop moving long enough to feel the ground shaking. Don't fix things for people, fix things with them. From then on, no major economic decision would be made without a field visit. No factory closure would be signed without community hearings. No budget would be approved without room for human dignity. Anatrance wasn't just producing cashew products anymore. It was producing a new way to govern. In the next election cycle, Ibrahim's approval didn't spike because of slogans or ads. It spiked because of what one young girl said on national radio, "My mom is strong again." The president didn't just save a factory, he saved my hero. Many called it a miracle. Ibrahim called it something else. It's not magic. It's what happens when leadership meets humanity. He knew not every crisis could be fixed, but this one was, and it taught the nation a truth no statistic could replace. Sometimes the most powerful act a leader can do is to stop, listen, and stay. Ibrahim never stood on a stage to claim victory. There was no parade, no personal documentary, no self-congratulating speech in the parliament. He didn't need any of it, because across the country, thousands of people were already telling his story for him. Not with hashtags, not with banners, but with their hands working again, building again, living again. The revival of Anatrance had become something greater than anyone anticipated. It had turned into a compass, a direction for a country once paralyzed by resignation. That was the new slogan spreading among communities. It appeared in textile co-ops, farming groups, teacher associations. In the north, women's groups that had never received formal funding began writing their own development plans. In the south, ex-combatants formed rehabilitation workshops. "Don't give us peace, let us build it." This was the invisible revolution that Anatrance had sparked a nation no longer begging for help, but demanding its chance to participate. Years later, when a documentary team tried to capture the Anatrance story, they asked Ibrahim for a quote to end their film. He sent back a handwritten note. If I am remembered at all, let it not be for what I built, but for the one time I stopped walking long enough to see what others had lost. That became the final frame of the film. Some say the true anthem of Burkina Faso was no longer the official tune. It was the hum of factory lines, the sound of chalk on classroom boards, the shouts of farmers at bustling rural markets. It was the voices of people who once whispered now, speaking boldly again. From think tanks in West Africa to policy centers in Europe, the Burkina model began to be studied. They called it embedded leadership governance that doesn't float above the people but sits down beside them, listens, builds. But for Ibrahim, it was never theory. I never planned a model, he told one reporter. I just couldn't ignore that girl in the square. That's where it all started. He wasn't trying to be remembered. He was trying not to forget. Anatrance kept growing. 10,000 plus farmers now supplied its raw cashews. A new training center opened next door, turning former workers into instructors. The brand became a national export icon, but the label always read, proudly rebuilt by the hands of our people. But the real inheritance wasn't economic. It was emotional, cultural, political. People no longer waited for solutions. They demanded participation. They believed again not in saviors, but in themselves. In his last year in office during a university visit, a student asked Ibrahim, "Why didn't you ever take credit for Anatrance?" He smiled gently. Because it wasn't mine. It belonged to the woman who stood up when no one else did, to the workers who returned before being called, to the farmers who waited with faith, not bitterness. He paused. I just stopped. They moved. Most leaders are remembered for their achievements. Ibrahim was remembered for his pause. And in that moment when he stood silently in front of a mother and her starving child, when he chose presence over power, when he refused to walk past suffering, a different kind of leadership was born. One that doesn't march ahead shouting instructions, but walks quietly behind, making sure no one gets left behind. Because sometimes, the strongest step a leader can take is to stop, so a nation can move forward, together. 3 months after the factory gates reopened, a ripple of quiet revolutions spread across Burkina Faso. What had begun as a crisis response transformed into a new national rhythm, where silence became strategy and presence became policy. In a remote village 200 kilometers from Anatrance, a group of teenage boys sat under a mango tree, staring at an old transistor radio. They weren't listening for music. They were waiting for updates on whether the local grain storage facility shut down during the previous administration would be revived like Anatrance. A small boy leaned over and whispered, "If he came for them, maybe he'll come for us too. Hope like drought travels far." In a dusty hallway in Ouagadougou's main hospital, a nurse who hadn't been paid in 5 months finished her shift humming the tune of an old freedom song. She tucked a handwritten message inside the suggestion box, "Come see us. Don't save us, just see us." By now, everyone understood what that meant. It wasn't a cry for aid. It was an invitation for dignity. The transformation wasn't just about production or economic figures. It was about trust. Trust that if they spoke, someone would listen. Trust that the president wouldn't just fly over crisis zones in a helicopter, but would walk on foot unannounced like he did on that fateful morning in the square. Of course, not everyone was ready for this new rhythm of leadership. In the capital's Economic Council, suited analysts scribbled on whiteboards, showing graphs that warned of populist inflation and unsustainable intervention models. One advisor, educated in London, muttered beneath his breath, "We need predictability, not philosophy." But another economist, older and quieter, simply pointed at the screen, displaying rising employment numbers, and murmured, "Perhaps we were the unpredictable ones." We forgot people don't live on forecasts. They live on food. What Anatrance had sparked was more than a case study, it was a cultural reckoning. Who gets seen, who gets heard, and what is a nation if not the sum of its invisible people? In Koudougou, A group of women farmers who once feared eviction from government-leased land started meeting weekly. Not to protest, but to plan. They called themselves Les Invisibles, not because they still felt unseen, but because they never wanted others to feel that way again. They created their own microcredit system. They trained young girls in agro-processing. They wrote letters not to ask for funds, but to offer proposals. One of them, a former cassava vendor named Aminata, stood in front of the town council and declared the president came for the factory. We will come for the fields. Their project was later named Daughters of the Ground. It became a national model for decentralized economic empowerment, led by those who once couldn't even enter the front door of the bank. On the desk of President Ibrahim sat a crayon-colored envelope. Inside was a letter from a schoolboy in the north. Dear Mr. President, my mother said you don't like speeches, so I drew you something. This is our old house with holes in the roof. This is my mom sewing now that she has a job, and this is me waving, because I can go to school every day now. There was no signature, just one sentence scrawled in shaky handwriting. Please don't forget the small people. He never did. That letter would later be framed, not in the National Archives, but in the hallway outside the presidential war room. Ministers passed by it each day, reminded not by metrics, but by the simple truth of a child's drawing. As the economy slowly shifted course, the nation's language also changed. People stopped saying, the government should, and started asking, how do we? Even radio stations noticed. Call-ins became less about complaints and more about contributions. Villagers phoned in to offer unused buildings for vocational centers. Retired mechanics volunteered to train youth in small engine repair. Elderly weavers sent patterns to schools to preserve traditional art. This wasn't policy, it was pride. Burkina Faso had discovered something the world had forgotten. When people are trusted, they rise. When people are seen, they shine. But ideas that empower the poor are dangerous to those who thrive in silence. Foreign companies began to whisper about regulatory unpredictability. NGOs accustomed to being the center of attention grew nervous about being sidelined by communities solving problems themselves. And in one quiet meeting room in Brussels, a consultant asked aloud, "What if other countries follow suit?" That was the power of Anatrents, not in its factories or its cashews or its headlines, but in the seed it planted a model where governments don't rescue from above, but rise from below. One day a journalist asked President Brahim, what was the turning point? He paused, then replied, "When I stopped moving." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. It was in that stillness in the city square, in the silence before answers, in the gap between question and action, that everything shifted. He had paused long enough for the truth to reach him, for pain to speak, for dignity to walk back through the gate of Anatrents, and remind a broken nation that power belongs to all of us. No one knew what would happen 10 years from now, or 20, but in a small rural classroom, children were now being taught the story of the woman who faced the president, not as a fairy tale, but as a case study in courage, because the future of Burkina Faso wasn't written in stone monuments or marble halls. It was written in factory sweat, in farmer footprints, in the quiet power of people who refused to stay invisible. And in that pause where one leader stopped walking and chose to stand still, a new road had opened. One not paved by politics, but by people. What no one predicted, what no strategy paper, think tank, or 5-year plan ever imagined was the wave that followed Anatrents. It didn't look like a wave. It had no color, no anthem, no headline. But it moved quietly, steadily through the arteries of the nation, awakening something that had long slept beneath the surface. The belief that change was not a gift handed down from above, but a force that rose from within. In a quiet suburb of Ouahigouya, a group of retired teachers gathered under a neem tree to begin tutoring students who had dropped out during the economic collapse. They brought no certificates. They printed no flyers. One simply said, "If we taught a generation before, we can teach one more." They called themselves Les Racines, the Roots. By the end of the year, dropout rates in the area fell by 18%. In a village near Banfora, young welders reopened a long-abandoned training workshop. They fixed broken wheelbarrows for farmers, repaired school gates, taught their younger cousins how to shape metal with fire. When asked who funded the project, their answer was simple: no one. We funded ourselves with sweat. It wasn't a miracle, it was a mirror. Anatrance had become a symbol not just of recovery, but of reflection. Across the country, people looked at it and asked, what is our version of that? Even in the halls of government, something shifted. The Ministry of Transport began inviting motorbike drivers to planning sessions for new roads. The Ministry of Agriculture launched a program where field officers slept overnight in villages before writing any policy. And the Ministry of Education. They scrapped 2 national curriculum revisions after students in pilot schools said they couldn't see themselves in the textbooks. No point teaching a nation what it never lived, said one deputy minister. The idea that leadership could listen first, legislate later, once mocked as naive, was now being embedded across institutions, not because of some radical ideology, but because it worked. People who are heard tend to build. People who are ignored tend to burn, but not everyone welcomed this new clarity. There were those who preferred the fog, who thrived in the gray areas between law and silence. Local power brokers, procurement cartels, absentee contractors who once made fortunes by pretending the people didn't know better. Now they were being challenged not by protests but by competence. In Kaya, when a private company tried to delay the construction of a rural health post, villagers built a temporary clinic themselves, then demanded the ministry only approve payments once the permanent building stood finished. In Gawa, after officials tried to divert funding from a women's cooperative, the group published their own budget transparency report, printed on colorful cloth sold in markets and impossible to ignore. It wasn't rebellion, it was responsibility. The old order trembled not because of noise, but because of knowledge. During the rainy season that followed Anatrance's revival, a flash flood struck several provinces in the east. Roads were washed out, markets submerged, thousands displaced. The nation waited to see what the government would do. But before the president could even summon an emergency meeting, something extraordinary happened. Local leaders trained informally through Anatrance-inspired programs had already mobilized young men, built temporary bridges from school desks and salvaged wood. Women organized food distribution from granaries. A group of former mechanics turned their repair shop into a mobile clinic. When the presidential convoy finally arrived, it found not panic but poise. We couldn't wait, one volunteer said. We learned that from Anatrance. If we wait to be rescued, we've already lost. Ibrahim, standing knee-deep in mud beside them, nodded. You didn't wait, he said. So we won't either. The government expedited funding. But the recovery was no longer just a government mission, it was a shared ethic. A new social contract signed not with pens, but with hands. Soon other nations began to notice. A delegation from Ghana visited the Anatrance plant. A youth minister from Senegal requested a briefing. In a closed-door session of the West African Development Council, an advisor whispered, "Is this replicable?" But replication wasn't the point. Anatrance wasn't a template, it was a trigger. What Burkina Faso had ignited wasn't a new system, but a new story. One where leaders didn't perform solutions, they practiced solidarity. Where the spotlight wasn't on presidential speeches, but on communal silence, broken by action. A French diplomat famously remarked, "This is not how modern governance works." To which one Burkina farmer replied, "Maybe that's the problem." Months later, President Ibrahim visited another industrial zone. This time one that hadn't yet collapsed, but was close. Workers had gone unpaid. Equipment outdated. Spirits low. He didn't bring a camera crew. He didn't wear a suit. He stood in the middle of the workshop floor, among grease and gears and silent machines. The manager tried to speak, The union rep tried to explain, but he held up his hand gently. Let's not talk yet. Just be still with me for a moment. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Then he spoke. Are we going to fix this, or are we going to wait until it dies, like Anatrans almost did? No one answered. They didn't need to. That night, workers stayed late, cleaning, cataloging, creating a plan. By dawn, a volunteer task force had formed. They named it before it's too late. Over time, these small moments, factory visits, village meetings, budget reviews with farmers accumulated into something profound. Burkina Faso was no longer sprinting for headlines or foreign aid packages. It was walking, together. Teachers walked with dropouts, elders walked with startups, ministers walked with janitors, and the president he walked slightly behind, not out of fear, but out of trust that the people could lead too. That was his real legacy, not the recovery of one plant, not the defiance of foreign consultants, not the policies or papers or models, but the decision in one silent moment to stop, and by doing so, let the nation begin. Months after Anatrans reopened its gates, a different kind of work began, one that wasn't measured in output, but in outlook. Something subtle had changed across Burkina Faso. It didn't come from the ministries or headlines. It came from the quiet spaces, the way a farmer now looked into the eyes of the buyer, the way a bus driver waited a little longer for an elderly passenger, the way neighbors gathered at dusk, not to complain but to imagine. The factory had sparked more than production. It had sparked perception. For the first time in years, people weren't just surviving. They were seeing each other again. And in a country long fractured by distrust between rural and urban poor, and privileged governed and governing, that shift in how people felt about themselves and one another may have been the greatest miracle of all. Not far from Anatrans, a group of young poets started meeting behind the old water tower. Some were sons of factory workers. Others were jobless youths who'd once thought of fleeing the country. Their spoken word nights became legendary. One poem titled "Steel and Skin" became a viral broadcast. They called us rusting parts, but we were always rhythm, always soul behind the smoke. We weren't broken, we were waiting. And now we build with breath, we dream in shifts. Teachers printed the lines and posted them in classrooms. One university even offered the lead poet a scholarship, not because he was famous, but because for the first time in a long time, the nation felt worth writing about again. There was a man named Kumba. Once a machinist at Anatrans, he had lost his leg in an accident years before the collapse. After the factory shuttered, he disappeared from the public eye. But after the revival, something brought him back. One morning he was seen sitting outside the plant polishing tools, with one hand offering advice to new workers with the other. "Why come back?" someone asked. He smiled and tapped his chest. "Because this is still working." Kumba was later hired as the plant's safety advisor. But more importantly, he became a symbol. The message, no one is too broken to return. In the western highlands, a sudden downpour flooded the roads, trapping 5 supply trucks en route to deliver raw cashews to Anatrans. It should have been a disaster. But within hours, a chain of villagers formed, dozens of men and women unloading the bags, by hand carrying them across makeshift wooden planks, singing old folk songs as they walked barefoot through the water. They worked all night, not because anyone ordered them to, but because Anatrans wasn't just a factory anymore. It was theirs. The drivers wept when they reached the plant. One left his cap on the loading dock with a note inside: "You taught us to care again." So we carried what mattered. The most profound change wasn't in infrastructure, but in inquiry. Before people asked, "Who will fix this? When will help come? Why are we forgotten?" Now they asked, "What can we do? Who needs our hands? How do we begin?" This change wasn't orchestrated by policy. It came from the memory of a man who chose to pause in a square in a war room in a moment of human confrontation and let the weight of a mother's words move a nation. From that one pause came an avalanche of questions, and from those questions new answers were built not in speeches but in sweat. One curious result of the Anatrins revival was the unexpected arrival of African diaspora engineers, designers, and organizers. People who had left years ago for Europe or America returned not as consultants but as comrades. A software engineer from Montreal helped build a logistics system for the new supply chain. A textile designer from Lagos created uniforms for the workers that reflected traditional Burkina patterns. One architect born in Paris to exiled parents redesigned the cafeteria into a circular open-air forum. He wept on the opening day. "My father died in exile," he said, placing a photo of his family in the corner. "But today I came home." Electricity had always been unstable in the industrial zones, but one evening a surge threatened to cut power during a major shipment. Instead of shutting down, workers held flashlights over conveyor belts, guided each crate by hand, and marked shipments manually. They didn't stop. Outside neighbors brought lanterns from their homes and stood along the fence lighting the way. At dawn, when the backup system finally kicked in, the night shift, workers cheered not for machines, but for each other. A journalist on site wrote, "Last night I saw a country that refused to go dark, not because the system worked, but because the people did." Ibrahim, by this point, had become more than a leader. He was an emblem, a quiet reference whispered in classrooms, in markets and street corners. What would he do? But the president himself grew wary of becoming a myth. So one day, without announcement, he began stepping back from daily headlines. No more surprise visits, no more press-stirring silence. He let others lead. He didn't vanish, he evolved. From captain to compass, from spotlight to soil, because what he had cultivated wasn't dependency, it was direction. The last executive order Ibrahim signed before the end of his term wasn't grand. It was just a line of text. Every national project before approval must answer this: will it restore dignity that became known as the Dignity Clause? Simple, unshakable, and utterly transformative. History often remembers revolutions by the noise they make, gunshots, slogans, protests echoing in the streets. But this one began in silence, a silence so sharp it pierced the heart of a nation, a silence born not from fear, but from the courage to stop, to look, to listen. Ibrahim didn't save Burkina Faso by lifting his voice. He saved it by lowering his gaze, meeting the eyes of a mother too tired to hope, too hungry to shout. That moment, unnoticed by cameras or headlines, became the turning point not just for a factory but for a philosophy. The real transformation wasn't Anatrans's machines restarting. It wasn't the new economic metrics or the foreign analysts scrambling to define a model. The real miracle was invisible: the way people stood up straighter, the way forgotten voices began to speak again, the way entire communities shifted from waiting to building. And in the end, that is what leadership is: not a spotlight, but a mirror. Not a hand that pulls from above, but a shoulder that stands beside. It is not the job of a leader to dazzle. It is the duty of a leader to see, and in seeing to restore what power so often steals dignity. Years from now, the cashew factory may fall silent again. Machines will age, policies will change, but one thing will remain unshaken: the memory of a man who paused and let his people move. That memory will not live in statues or textbooks. It will live in gestures. A child offering a seat to an elder, a farmer fixing a neighbor's broken tool, a teacher staying after class unpaid because the light in a student's eyes was payment enough. Those are the true signs that something sacred has begun. This was not the story of a factory. It was the story of how a nation, once paralyzed by silence, learned to listen to itself again. And that is how countries are not just rebuilt, but reborn. A teacher staying after class unpaid because the light in a student's eyes was payment enough. Those are the true signs that something sacred has begun. This was not the story of a factory. It was the story of how a nation, once paralyzed by silence, learned to listen to itself again. And that is how countries are not just rebuilt, but reborn.